The year was 1977, and the streets of Cleveland were soaked in something darker than rain. This is the story of a man who laughed in the face of the most dangerous criminal organization in American history, and somehow kept laughing. A man who wore a green shamrock on his collar while standing in the rubble of car bombs that should have killed him. A man the mob tried to murder not once, not twice, but over a dozen times, and failed every single time. Until one Tuesday morning in October. Until one parking lot. Until one small hidden device that changed everything. But before we get to that morning, before we talk about the bomb, the betrayal, and the silence that followed, we need to go back. Back to the docks of Cleveland. Back to a boy who had nothing, and decided that the world owed him everything. Danny Greene was born in 1933 in Collinwood, a tough Irish neighborhood on the east side of Cleveland, Ohio. His mother died when he was just 3 years old, and his father, unable to cope, handed him off to his grandfather. From the very beginning, life told Danny Greene he didn't matter. And Danny Greene looked life dead in the eye and said, "Watch me." He grew up scrappy, fearless, and magnetic. Other kids followed him. Adults noticed him. There was something about Danny that couldn't be ignored, a raw, burning energy that made people either want to stand beside him or stay far, far away. He read books about Celtic warriors. He painted his apartment green. He genuinely believed in his bones that he was descended from ancient Irish kings, that he was protected by something spiritual, something no bullet or bomb could touch. That belief, that absolute, unshakable belief, would define every decision he ever made. By the time he was in his 20s, Danny had worked his way into the International Longshoremen's Association, eventually becoming president of Local 1317 on the Cleveland docks. And here's where the story gets darker. Because Danny didn't just run the union. He owned it. He embezzled funds, threatened members, and operated with the kind of casual brutality that made powerful people take notice. The FBI eventually caught up with him, investigated him for corruption, fraud, misuse of union funds. But here's the thing about Danny Greene. Even when cornered, he found a way to turn the trap into a door. Facing serious charges, Danny made a decision that would reshape his entire life. He became an FBI informant. He fed information quietly, carefully, using the relationship to protect himself while simultaneously building deeper ties with Cleveland's organized crime world. He was playing multiple sides of a very dangerous board, and somehow he kept his balance. Because Danny Greene wasn't just surviving the criminal underworld. He was climbing it. By the early 1970s, he had become deeply connected to the Cleveland crime family, working alongside men like John Nardi and taking on muscle work, loan sharking operations, and eventually explosives. Danny had developed a fascination, almost a love, for bombs. He learned how they worked. He learned how to build them. And he used that knowledge with terrifying precision against his enemies. What made Danny Greene different from every other street-level criminal trying to claw his way up wasn't just his fearlessness. It was his theatrics. He wore green constantly, green shirts, green cars, a green leaf clover symbol he put on everything. He gave interviews. He taunted his enemies publicly. When the mob sent men to kill him, he would walk out of the wreckage, dust himself off, and practically dare them to try again. There's a story, and this one is absolutely true, where a bomb was placed in Danny's apartment building. The explosion tore through the structure. Neighbors were thrown from their beds. And Danny Greene walked out of the smoke with barely a scratch, turned to the crowd that had gathered and reportedly said, "They can't kill me. I'm Irish." Can you imagine being the man who planted that bomb? Can you imagine calling your boss and explaining that Danny Greene was still alive and smiling? The mob tried to kill him with shooters. Failed. They tried car bombs. Failed. They tried ambushes, planted explosives, hired professionals. Failed. Danny seemed to exist outside the normal rules of mortality. And with every failed attempt, his legend grew, not just on the streets of Cleveland but inside the mob itself, where fear and respect are the same currency. By the mid-1970s, Danny Greene had become something truly unusual, a one-man criminal enterprise operating in open defiance of La Cosa Nostra. He was bombing rivals. He was making alliances and breaking them. He was living in a modest green-painted house in Lyndhurst, a Cleveland suburb, tending to his garden in the mornings like an ordinary man, and ordering violence in the afternoons like a warlord. The mob bosses in Cleveland, and their connections in New York, were no longer just annoyed by Danny Greene. They were humiliated. Every failed assassination was a message to the entire underworld. This Irish lunatic cannot be stopped. And so they stopped sending amateurs. They began planning something more careful, more patient. Something that would require the right man, the right moment, and a bomb hidden in exactly the right place. In October of 1977, that plan was finally ready. But what happened in that parking lot, and who was really behind the order, revealed a web of betrayal so deep, it would eventually bring down an entire crime family. What would you do if you found out the person you trusted most was the one who finally led your enemies to your door? The answer to that question is coming, and it will change everything you think you know about Danny Greene's final morning. The autumn of 1977 had settled over Cleveland like a cold, gray shroud. The leaves were turning, the wind was sharp, and somewhere in the back rooms of the Cleveland crime family, a plan had been set into motion that even the most seasoned mob bosses believed would finally end the Danny Greene problem. But to understand why October 6, 1977 became the day everything changed, you have to understand what was happening beneath the surface of Cleveland's underworld in the months leading up to it. Because this wasn't just a hit. This was the result of a slow, burning collapse, of alliances crumbling, of paranoia spreading like poison through the veins of organized crime, and of one man who refused to stop poking the most dangerous organization in the world with a very sharp stick. By 1977, the Cleveland mob was in crisis. Their boss, James "Jack White" LeCavalier, was under enormous pressure, from the FBI, from internal power struggles, and from the embarrassment of Danny Greene still breathing. Danny had aligned himself closely with John Nardi, a high-ranking union official with his own mob ties, and together the two men had essentially declared a shadow war against the LeCavalier faction. They were bombing. They were muscling. They were operating with a boldness that left the establishment reeling. John Nardi was killed first. A bomb planted under his car in a Cleveland parking lot detonated on May 17, 1977. The explosion was catastrophic. And when Danny Greene heard the news, something shifted in him. A rare crack in that armor of Celtic invincibility he had always worn so proudly. Nardi had been his closest ally. His partner. One of the few men Danny had actually trusted. And now he was gone. Did Danny pull back? Did he go quiet, lay low, reconsider his position? No. He did the opposite. He grew louder. He gave a television interview, on camera using his full name, and he looked directly into the lens and warned the Cleveland mob that he was not afraid. He called them cowards. He said they were weak. He said the Irish had been fighting longer than any of them, and that he would still be standing when they were all in the ground. It was either the bravest thing anyone had ever done, or the most reckless. Probably both. But here is where the story takes its darkest turn. Because the people who finally succeeded in killing Danny Greene didn't come from a direction he was watching. They came from somewhere much closer. The man who became the key to Danny's death was someone operating inside the web of connections Danny himself had helped to build. A man named Ronald Carabia, connected to the mob's Youngstown faction, who worked with a bomb maker named Raymond Ferrito. Ferrito was a professional. Not the kind of hothead who had fumbled previous attempts on Danny's life. He was patient, methodical, and he understood something critical that others had missed. Danny Greene's greatest vulnerability wasn't his body. It was his routine. Because for all his warrior mythology, Danny Greene was in some ways a surprisingly ordinary man day to day. He had a dentist. He had appointments. He moved through his neighborhood with a confidence that bordered on carelessness, because deep down, he genuinely believed the Celtic gods were watching over him. And so they watched him. They studied his movements. They identified his dentist's office in Lyndhurst, a quiet suburb that felt a world away from the bomb craters and blood-soaked alleys of Cleveland's east side. They noted when he came, when he left, where he parked. And then Raymond Ferrito did something elegant in its terrible simplicity. He obtained a car, packed it with explosives, and parked it in the lot next to the space Danny typically used. It wasn't a rushed job. It wasn't panic. It was geometry. It was patience. It was the kind of cold calculation that Danny's own explosive personality had always made impossible for him to fully anticipate, because Danny Greene operated on fire and instinct, and the men who finally killed him operated on ice and mathematics. On the morning of October 6th, Danny drove to his dentist appointment in Lyndhurst. He parked his car. He went inside. He sat in the chair, probably joking with the staff the way he always did, probably radiating that impossible charm that made people adore him even as they feared him. And when he walked back out into the cool October air, he got into his car. The bomb in the adjacent vehicle was triggered remotely. The explosion was devastating. It killed Danny Greene almost instantly, tearing through the driver's side of his car with a force that left investigators stunned. And yet, and this detail is almost unbearable in its symbolism, his right arm, the arm wearing his Celtic ring, was found some distance from the wreckage. Intact. The ring still on his finger. As if even in death, some part of Danny Greene refused to be completely destroyed. The streets of Cleveland went quiet in a way they hadn't in years. The man who had survived more than a dozen attempts on his life, the man who had walked out of explosions, the man who had stared into television cameras and dared organized crime to come for him, was gone. Just like that. On an ordinary Tuesday morning. At a dentist's office in the suburbs. But here is the question that nobody was asking loudly enough in the immediate aftermath, and it's the question that would unravel everything. How did they know he would be there? How did they know exactly which space he would park in on that exact morning? The answer to that question wasn't just about Danny Greene's death. It was about something much bigger. Something that would trigger a chain reaction so explosive, in the legal sense this time, that it would shake the Cleveland mob to its foundation, drag names into courtrooms across the country, and ultimately lead investigators to one of the most significant mob prosecutions in American history. Danny Greene died in that parking lot. But the story didn't die with him. In fact, it was only just beginning. The silence after Danny Greene's death didn't last long. In fact, it lasted almost no time at all. Because the men who killed him made a mistake. The kind of mistake that professionals should never make, the kind that comes from overconfidence, from the belief that once the body hits the ground, the danger is over. They were wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Raymond Ferrito, the bomb maker who had so patiently, so methodically planned Danny Greene's final morning, had been seen. Not by a cop. Not by an FBI agent staking out the parking lot. By an ordinary person. A witness who noticed a man behaving strangely near the cars in that Lyndhurst lot before the explosion. The description was vague at first. But it was enough. Enough to pull a thread. And when you pull a thread on a sweater as old and tangled as the Cleveland mob, the whole thing comes apart in your hands. Law enforcement had been circling Danny Greene's world for years. The FBI, local police, federal prosecutors, they all understood that Danny existed at the intersection of something enormous. His connections ran from Cleveland to Youngstown to New York. His story touched union corruption, organized crime hierarchies, FBI informant networks, and decades of carefully protected criminal enterprise. His death, rather than closing a chapter, ripped the book wide open. Within weeks of the bombing, investigators were closing in on Raymond Ferrito. And here is where the story takes the kind of turn that Danny Greene himself would have appreciated: dark, ironic, and utterly human. When Raymond Ferrito realized the walls were closing in, when he understood that the evidence against him was mounting and that the people who had hired him would not protect him, he made the same calculation Danny Greene had made years earlier, standing in front of federal investigators with the weight of criminal charges pressing down on him. He talked. Ferrito became a government witness. And what he gave prosecutors wasn't just the details of Danny Greene's murder. It was a roadmap. Names, dates, conversations, orders. He described how Ronald Carabia had coordinated the hit. He described the chain of command running back through the Cleveland family to James LeCavalier himself. He described meetings and phone calls and decisions made in back rooms by men who believed they were untouchable. And suddenly, the death of Danny Greene, one man, one parking lot, one Tuesday morning, became the key that unlocked a federal prosecution that would shake American organized crime to its core. The case that followed is known today as one of the most successful RICO prosecutions in FBI history. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, had been on the books since 1970, but prosecutors had struggled to use it effectively against the mob's layered, insulated structures. Danny Greene's murder changed that. The evidence gathered in the aftermath of his death gave federal agents exactly what they needed to tie together years of criminal activity into a single devastating legal case. James LeCavalier was convicted. Ronald Carabia was convicted. Raymond Ferrito, despite cooperating, faced his own reckoning. One by one, the men who had ordered, planned, and celebrated Danny Greene's death found themselves in courtrooms, in handcuffs, in prison cells. The Cleveland crime family, already weakened by years of internal warfare that Danny himself had helped accelerate, collapsed. It never truly recovered. To this day, Cleveland is considered one of the most diminished mob cities in America, a ghost of what it once was. And the connection didn't stop at Cleveland. The Danny Greene investigation fed into a broader national effort that helped prosecutors build cases against mob families in other cities. The tentacles of the case stretched into New York, into Youngstown, into the very heart of La Cosa Nostra's American operation. One man. One explosion. An unraveling that nobody in organized crime had anticipated, least of all the men who thought they were finally solving their Danny Greene problem. But there is something else. Something that sits quietly beneath all the courtroom victories and criminal convictions, and it has nothing to do with law enforcement or legal strategy. It has to do with who Danny Greene actually was, and what his life, stripped of all the mythology and the green shamrocks and the Celtic warrior posturing, actually meant. Danny Greene grew up with nothing. He was handed rejection before he was old enough to understand it. He built himself from scratch using the only materials available to him: his fists, his mouth, his nerve, and an almost supernatural refusal to accept that the world had the right to limit him. Was he a good man? No. He was responsible for violence, for fear, for destruction. People suffered because of choices he made. That cannot be softened or romanticized away. But there is something in his story that goes beyond the crime and the chaos, something that speaks to a very specific kind of human hunger. The hunger to matter. To be seen. To walk through a world that tried to make you small and say loudly with your whole chest, "I am here. You cannot erase me." Danny Greene said that with bombs and bravado and green paint and television interviews. He said it in ways that were dangerous and destructive and ultimately fatal. But he said it with a conviction that very few people, criminal or otherwise, ever managed to summon. And the terrible irony is that in trying to erase him, the mob made him permanent. Every attempt on his life built the legend higher. And even his death, especially his death, set off a chain of consequences so far-reaching that his name is still spoken today in discussions about organized crime, about RICO prosecutions, about the fall of the American mob's golden era. They wanted to silence Danny Greene. Instead, they gave him the loudest ending possible. There is a grave in Cleveland. It is modest, marked simply. People still visit it. They leave shamrocks sometimes. Small green things placed by strangers who never met the man but felt, somehow, that his story deserved to be acknowledged. That a boy from Collinwood who refused to disappear, even when the most powerful criminal organization in the country was trying to make him do exactly that, deserved to be remembered. Raymond Ferrito died in 2004. James LeCavalier died in prison in 1985. The Cleveland mob faded into the history books. But Danny Greene, the Celtic warrior, the Irishman the Mafia couldn't kill, the man who walked out of explosions and smiled, Danny Greene became something none of his enemies ever did. He became a story worth telling. And the next time someone tells you that one person cannot shake an entire system, that one stubborn, fearless, impossible human being cannot walk into the machinery of power and throw a wrench so deep that it takes decades to pull out, remember a parking lot in Lyndhurst, Ohio. Remember a Celtic ring found in the rubble. Remember a man who looked at the most dangerous organization in America and said 4 words that defined his entire life. "They can't kill me." He was wrong in the end. But only barely. And only once.